Welcome to the God Pill. Today we are going to talk about demoralization. We are all well aware of the propaganda the leftist globalists insert into any media they can get their hands on. We know that a big chunk of it is to manufacture consent. Shows like The Modern Family played an enormous statistically verified effect in increasing support for gay marriage in the years before a Supreme Court ruling, as an example. But what if I were to tell you that shows, films, books, and comics these oligopolies in media produce are not merely to shape minds and public opinion, though they bear a more sinister purpose as well? I'll get to that soon. When Ayn Rand tried to get her first novel, We the Living, published, it was quite a challenge. The Soviet Union had placed agents and sympathetic collaborators on boards and in executive positions of many of America's publishing companies. Naturally, they wouldn't want a book detailing the truth of life in the Soviet Union by a woman that had seen the revolution and what followed firsthand. And that, of course, that penetration of the media in the 20s and 30s was only the beginning of it by that arm of the globalist octopus. Many had preceded it, as we have all seen. If the elites were pragmatic, they wouldn't push the cultural envelope much farther than they have. If anything, they went a bit fast and woke a lot of people up. But as another YouTuber noted in the past week, this dystopia ahead is about sadism, not economics. They must push the envelope. They must increase the power differential between them and their victims. They must force their boots harder on your face. Just as the Second World War played out the Hegelian dialectic and brought many of the outcomes it intended, so did the Cold War. After the metaphorical dust settled of the tension between the capitalist West and Soviet Union with the collapse of the USSR, a new America gradually emerged, not capitalist, not communist, but a synthesis of the two. The world we see today, that of the oxymoron of left-wing corporations, where profit is the means, not the end being power and influence. These companies will happily lose billions of profits by alienating customers or kneecap their revenue potential by turning out inferior products, if it means getting their messages out. Because power is their aim, not prosperity, these champagne socialists only need enough profit to keep the lights on and the output going. We're all wise to it now, but for a while it was really ingenious. This is a compromise the foot soldiers, knowing or unknowing, have to make with reality, something those higher up understand. A parasite cannot kill the host. It must find the ideal ratio of extraction, where it takes as much as it can from the host organism, without it collapsing, providing a steady engorgement as its power grows. This is what we see with these woke corporations. This is what we see with modern mixed economies and socialist economies that aren't full commie. The aim of all the propaganda is not just to persuade people. They've pushed the envelope quite a bit socially, everything short of making harming kids acceptable at this point. Another objective is to fool people into thinking various points of view, ideologies, and lifestyles are more common or mainstream than they are. This serves a dual purpose. If the person is oriented around fitting in with the crowd, then they will be easily carried along. If the people are resistant to the agenda, the funhouse mirror on the screen can be mistaken for the real world and depress the person. When a person is depressed, a calculation was made and chemicals are released in the brain to discourage a person from fighting something or accomplishing a goal. Part of their mind thinks they can't take on. This often happens in Animal Kingdom to protect the creature from the threat a stronger male would present, if it faced them in establishing status in the hierarchy. This is what the elites want to do to you. They want to break your will before any fight even starts, to embed in you the belief that resistance is futile. And this animal dynamic is what the status-starved masses at the lower levels of the system want to do. They want not the equality they preach, but to invert the naturally emergent social hierarchies of the past and exert absolute dominance on you, and I mean it, serious, sadistic stuff is wished on you on some level. On the side, this is why women are more depressed than men, because their cowardice from lower testosterone levels makes them assume less agency in their lives, less fight in fight or flight. So they experience depression from the self-imposed impotence. You heard of the expression, there is no fight left in him? That's the point of demoralization, and that is one of their primary goals. Increasingly, it will become their main aim, and propaganda will be more specifically engineered to demoralize you. The main mechanism of this is to give you a sense of no escape, and that is why the agenda will be pushed further and further and further, even far past where it's necessary to make the agendas it pushes mainstream, because they need to torment you. They need to spread the cancer and make it increasingly pervasive, to produce that sense of helplessness, to provide you no refuge, no escapism. They can have their safe spaces from reality. You can't have a safe space from their dysfunction. This is why some shows can't go a full episode without political preaching. It's why it's becoming increasingly hard to see any shows with more than 3 characters in it where they are white and straight. This is why Netflix advertises playlists of children's shows for parents to introduce their children to homosexuality. There can be no competition of vision. There can be no utopia except their dystopian satanic inversion. This is why the devil's empire must become centralized. It must not be hundreds of principalities, but a global force, so that all of humanity will be one neck under one leash. Because civilizations that are less corrupted will outcompete those that are. Just as the US defeated the Soviet Union, evil can never defeat reality. Instead of the adversary strengthening a nation to conquer the world, in our time he works to achieve his goals that he has had since the time of Nimrod, by seeing to it that the nations suffer the same cancer simultaneously, as they are steadily dragged into line by the international forces referred to in the book of Habakkuk as the Chaldean destroyer of nations. While globalist agents have been at work in America since the nation's founding and gained traction as early as the beginning of the 20th century, the process of ideological subversion really kicked in back in the 60s. And in America, it wasn't only by the Soviets. A lot of it was by the British, as well as other factions in the world. It went quite far. Culture was devastated. But America dragged itself out of the cynicism of the psychological abuse thanks to a man named George Lucas. His franchise Star Wars, influenced by Joseph Campbell's book The Hero with a Thousand Faces, reinvigorated the West with a renewed optimism. This progressed further for a time in the 80s before the agenda began to gain ground again in the 90s. The process of demoralization is meant to last the time it takes for a child to go through the school system and perhaps college, typically a single generation, before the process proceeds to the following stages. This is why the globalists, through Disney, purchased Lucasfilm. They already had Marvel Comics, Warner Brothers controlled DC, and Warner Brothers was partially owned by George Soros. But Star Wars was special. The elites did not want a franchise that powerful to affect the world again in a way adverse to their goals. Hollywood did not need Star Wars for propaganda. They had a reliable enough supply of content for that. They did not want it for money, though they absolutely wanted to mine it for years to come. They wanted it to control any new narratives the intellectual property might create. Just as importantly, they wanted to use it to abuse you. They wanted to vandalize it as a form of psychological violence on the generations that have enjoyed it. That's why there are endless negative commentary and reactions on the Disney Star Wars films, because it provoked emotions. It got under many people's skin, as it was meant to. You have to understand that conservatives tend to have better amygdalas. One of the effects of this is that while liberals tend to hold only 3 of the 6 moral foundations, care versus harm, justice versus cheating, and liberty versus oppression, conservatives and libertarians also have the values of loyalty versus betrayal, authority versus subversion, and sanctity versus degradation. This means that people with stronger amygdalas, which make them better at the pattern recognition that assists them in identifying the conspiracies in their world, are also sensitive to demoralization through acts of betrayal, persistent and unchecked subversion, and attacks on things they hold sacred, treasured things in their childhood, often ones associated with the true, the good, and the beautiful, including works of fiction. After the initial anger, these attacks stimulate feelings of low trust, hopelessness, lack of agency, and disgust. The old fan bases gradually succumb to apathy and detach from fictional properties to reduce their pain. They also can become more vulnerable to nihilism and eventually moral relativism from observing the scale and pace of the cancer's unchecked growth in the world over time. I can speak firsthand to the trauma that the deep state has inflicted on people through Marvel. I don't need to go into SJW Marvel, many YouTubers do at length. The best is the Fourth Age, and I recommend you check out his videos. They are a great introduction to classical philosophy. But I will talk about one franchise nearest and dearest in my past, Spider-Man. I've read the first 500 issues of Spider-Man as a kid. I was very into the character, to put it mildly, from when I was just old enough to read. I was a couple of years behind, though, on the main continuity. I was just starting to get back into it when Superior Spider-Man came out, a storyline that starts with Dr. Octopus switching brains with Spider-Man, and Peter dying in Octavius' body, and Dr. Octopus controls Parker's body for over 30 issues. To add insult to injury, in the 9th issue, Octavius re-murders Parker in a mental battle with a remaining fragment of his psyche, by breaking his will, convincing him that the villain is morally superior, at least in a specific situation. I can't do that era justice. Honestly, it's been too long. But it was painful. Every 2 weeks, Dan Slott turned out a new issue. My family was in a very personal crisis of sorts at that time, one in which I might have prevented the potential murder of a relative. But when we went to therapy over the year after, I devoted more time to talking about, detailing, and processing Slott's moral relativistic filth than the very serious issues I and some of my relatives had endured recently, and far into the past. It wasn't evasion, it was that the shenanigans seemed bigger than my own immediate circumstances. Imagine if you were imprisoned and had to watch one of the people you cared about beaten, tortured, and dissected for a year or two. This is how Spider-Man's fanbase felt like in the decade or so after One More Day, the story in which Parker sells his marriage to the devil to save his aunt. As someone that wrote extensively from when I was 14 years old on, and studied literature, I had come to the conclusion that the Spider-Man mythology was the most significant narrative to emerge from Western civilization in roughly the past millennium. I can go into that some other day, perhaps, but this was because it covered better than any work of fiction the most significant sub-conflict of the defining conflict of Western civilization from the time of Robin Hood, if Fitzooth was a historical person. Superior Spider-Man assaulted the character of Peter Parker, but the prior story, One More Day, and the sequel, One Moment in Time, murdered it in the literary sense. They were just as traumatic as was Marvel's executives and employees' belligerent attitude toward their customers over the span of nearly 15 years since. I got over it back around 2015, realized it is unwise for any man to invest in any work of fiction they did not create, as it is a point of vulnerability social justice warriors can use against people with quality amygdalas. I would not leave myself vulnerable to them. It may seem silly to a lot of people, and I don't really mind, but participating on forums for several years back then, I can say I was far from alone in the pain. Moving on to video games, we only have to look at how the justifiably widely loathed feminist Anita Sarkeesian that endlessly attacks the gaming industry is after all these years still brought in as a consultant on video games. To know the gaming industry also has psychological operations in play. They are not bringing her in to produce feminist criticism. She is not capable of making them lose money. They're bringing her into the creative process of these games because they know how you feel about her, and again, they want to demoralize you. These corporate leftists want you to be miserable as they vandalize the brands their companies once built for your enjoyment, even as they try to extract cash from your wallet. Raging Golden Eagle has been covering how Funimation has not been content with censoring anime by not translating some of the Japanese to English, and the English voice actors using their own feminist and other leftist dialogue instead. Now they are trying to insert themselves into the boards of the companies that produce the animes. They are not doing this for money, but power. They want control of the anime at the source. It's easy to see where things would go from there. The American corporations would expand their influence, eventually buying the companies, and then they would buy the companies that publish the mangas, establishing a grip on what is and is not published, filmed, or animated as complete as they have over Western media. Why would American companies take such an interest in these intellectual properties if they know that we're approaching neo-feudalism and capitalism is on its way out thanks to them? It's not because they need anime or other creative products of foreign markets as the intellectual properties they would need when superheroes, Star Wars, and proven late 20th century franchises are burnt out by their crap. It's much worse. These Luciferians see people searching for quality entertainment and escapism outside their system, and they want to take it away from you. These innocents are like young children escaping a gulag, malnourished, barely crawling to the beauty of a flower left untouched. Then they come in like a guard that rather than simply taking the child, crushes the flower in front of him to crush his spirit. Even if the entertainment does not necessarily match Western values, in all cases, like old American media, it can be quality escapism, and they cannot permit escapism. There must be no escape from their system. They must demoralize you until you are broken, until you are compliant, until you obey. Ayn Rand correctly identified their enemy, man's mind. They want you as broken as Winston after his tortures, or any other citizen in 1984. They must attack fiction, not only because subverting it can influence people and distort people's perception by presenting an inaccurate view of the world outside your window, not only because vandalizing it will give you a sense of helplessness, of no escape, but also because in the Aristotelian sense, a story is supposed to be, in some ways, a representation of reality, and evil is at war with reality. They cannot allow truth and virtue to come through, even in fiction, because a story is a form of rhetorical argument, and we are all aware how tyrants and social justice warriors feel about criticism of the narrative and dissent. Our enemies are at war with God through atheism, secularism, and pantheism. They are at war with truth through solipsistic, subjective views of reality. Their virtue is under assault by the cult of amorality and moral grayness, and beauty is under attack by ugly art and body positivity. At the height of the USSR, politicians labeled the Soviet Union an evil empire. Different people might emphasize different components of the system we face, but regardless of what the power hierarchy is of different groups in the globalist machine, it is Luciferian at its root, and in recognition of this ravenous revolt against reality, I shall label the New World Order we are facing the Empire of Unreality. It may seem a minor issue, even a petty one in the grand scheme of things, as we prepare to the extent we can for what is coming. And I'm sure a lot of us have already grown more hardened from these kinds of psychological assaults the past 20 years. But for the younger men, I do urge you to take it to heart. Don't think of what they are doing as the devil taking stuff away from you, but that his world has less to offer. If you get in touch with your own creative side and churn out output, even if you never commit it to a form external to your mind, it'll be like having a lamp with you. You need to concern yourself with the streetlights being out. The entire omniverse was created by a single consciousness. I challenge you, brothers, to craft your own legends, songs, art, and inventions, not concerning yourself with gatekeepers in the empire of unreality. Your creative output itself is an act of rebellion, regardless of distribution. Remember, guys, while they will succeed in a sense, ruling the world for 1 hour, as it were, ultimate victory will be ours. They are against the Almighty, and while we face many superhuman adversaries behind the scenes, when it comes to spirits, there are more of them with us than against us, as we approach the great day of God Almighty. If you've enjoyed this video, don't hesitate to like, share, subscribe, donate, and comment. Let's make it to 30 subscribers this month. Until next time, courage is the first of human qualities, because it is this quality that guarantees the others.